this, I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Mr. Gabe Valdez, who is the middle son of the late Gabe Valdez. Gabe Valdez was a long-time New Mexico State Patrol officer in charge of Dulce, New Mexico for many years. And he passed away in 2011, and now his middle son, Greg, has carried on his very important investigations into the alleged Dulce underground base. And he has written a book called Dulce Base, and he was so kind enough and gracious enough to offer each one of you a free copy of his book in a PDF format, which will be posted on New Mexico, the NMUFOconference.com in a very, maybe in the next day or two. So here is Greg Valdez, who himself became a New Mexico State Patrol officer, and he continues with his important research about the alleged Dulce underground base in northern New Mexico. It's Greg Valdez.
Thanks, Nora. Thank you guys for coming out today. Let me get this pulled up real quick. Who's heard about the Dulce Base? It's pretty good show. It's pretty famous or infamous, whatever you want to call it. Like Norio mentioned, I'm the son of Gabe Valdez. Gabe was stationed up in Dulce. There's a lot of people here from Dulce, which is, I'm glad to see a lot of old friends. So there's it's a long story. I'm going to try to condense about a 12-hour story into an hour. So I hope I don't blow through this too fast, but we'll get you on track, and I'll try to separate. There's a lot of bad stuff floating around about Dulce, but bits and pieces of it are true, and it's actually an interesting story. So I'll try to cover everything as in detail as possible. If you catch me later, I can fill you in on some of the other details if I skip over something. And like Norio said, you can read the book. The book's a history of how the stories came about in regards to Dulce. Some of them are blatant lies that the government intentionally proposed or injected into the story, and some of them are true. So the whole purpose of the book was try to kind of separate the bad stuff from the good. So we'll kind of get going here. And the key question is what really happened. For those of you that don't know about Dulce, there's supposed to be this alleged underground alien joint U.S. Government Air Force base that's underground, and there's a variety of different stories that flow from that. So the key question that we try to figure out is what really happened, what parts of the story are true and what parts of the story are not true. What do you know? Some of you have probably heard some of the rumors. You got Phil Schneider, Thomas Costello, obviously the alien. You got Dulce Papers is a story that kind of came up in the 80s from John Lear. As I mentioned, there's supposed to be an underground base. An alien firefight supposedly happened there in 1979. And former workers were supposedly killed. There's estimates 77 people, some say it's 60, it kind of varies. So those are the common stories that are floating around. Like I mentioned earlier, some are true, some are false. And I'll try to explain where those stories came from, and you guys can look into it in more detail if you want, but at least you know you're looking in the right place or in the wrong place. So just be cautious when you see some of the internet stuff. As I mentioned earlier, my dad was in Dulce. He was a state police officer. In 1976, he kind of got thrown into this mystery because there was a lot of cattle mutilations happening in New Mexico. Some of you younger people probably never heard of the cattle mutilation, but they're finding these dead cattle throughout the nation and even worldwide. There was a large amount of them that happened in the Dulce area. They started in the Gomez Ranch, but a lot of the tribal members had their cattle mutilated. In Chama, Terra Maria area, they had mutilations, Taos, Angel Fire, southern Colorado, and then it moved up to Montana. And like I said, it was nationwide. They also had a lot in Colorado. So that's how my dad got involved, kind of how this whole story starts. So we're going to go to the very beginning. In 1976, the first mutilation in Dulce was at the Gomez Ranch. And at this mutilation, they found these tripod marks. You can kind of see them. And obviously a dead cow. So that's where the story started.
right after this happened, a lot of local tribal members, my dad, law enforcement, they started seeing these strange aircraft flying around, which is typically referred to as UFOs. Now, I'm not necessarily saying they're alien, but they're unidentified. It was pretty common on any given night. You could go out, and it's called Mundo Ridge, and after 10:30 at night, you could see these aircraft flying around. Several occasions they would chase him around. I think Gabe Valdez here, he's probably part of that crew with my dad that chased him around. Or Raleigh Tafoya was the chief of the tribal police. They had quite an adventure back in the 70s. And Raleigh's kids are here today, so they can tell you some of the stories. But it was pretty wild time back in those days. Like I mentioned, the lights were pretty easy to see at any given time. They would chase him around. Their objective was to shoot one out of the air to figure out what it was, which is kind of wild, but that's how they did things up there. So that's just how my dad and Raleigh and Hoyt did things. One of the weird things they noticed is one night they were chasing one, and they still didn't know what it was. They couldn't figure it out, but they would get on the police radio and say, hey, it's at this location, let's try to corner it, and the light would disappear and show up in another location. Well, they finally got smart and said, let's talk to an Apache. And my dad he knew enough to get himself into trouble or out of trouble, so they started talking to Apache. They were actually able to corner one in the gas buggy area. And they tried to shoot it out of the sky, but it flew over them, and they never got any shots off. And I don't know if that's the smartest thing to do, but they at least tried it. But what they did notice is that aircraft had a small engine sound. It sounded like a lawnmower, a small lawnmower. And because of the fact that whoever's piloting this aircraft didn't speak Apache, it kind of had them on their, at least paying attention that this might not be aliens, because that was the common thing that they were looking at the beginning. But it looked like they were human pilots, because if they didn't speak Apache, but they did understand English, you had some things going on there. So that was kind of like a red flag that they paid attention to at the initial beginning, the initial phase of all those sightings, the UFO sightings. So you have to figure out the UFO sightings tied to the Dulce Base, or they're separate. What's the case going on with all these strange lights and then all these dead cattle kind of popping up? I'm gonna kind of talk about the mutilations. That's a whole book in itself, and that's like hours worth of talk. But it comes down to is you have a couple theories for the mutilations. They're either humans are killing them, predators are killing them, or aliens are killing them. Doing this for a long time, I'm going to condense everything. All the evidence points to humans. And it looks like they were testing for a lot of germ warfare testing. And when I say they, I mean in the government. And a lot of contamination. The early mutilations have a ton of evidence that show they were testing for nuclear fallout contamination. Let me see, let me go back. Norio mentioned earlier at the opening presentation that they detonated the gas buggy atomic device outside of Dulce. That device, they later found out had a leak, so they were leaking radiation for about 30 years before they found the leak and capped the well and did some other stuff. They also flared the gas that was so contaminated from the radioactivity that it landed in the brush, so it looked like they were doing a lot of testing on the cattle to follow that up. People always say, why didn't they just go buy the cattle if they were doing that? That's a good question, but it also would have panicked a lot of the ranchers, and you have a lot of different things. So I'm not going to get too much detail in the mutilations, but that's where this whole story starts. So my dad kind of, by default, became one of the leading researchers into the cattle mutilations. Senator Harrison Schmitt, who was an Apollo astronaut from New Mexico, set up a conference on cattle mutilations here in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, in '79. My dad was a speaker at this conference, and at the conference he meets a guy named Paul Benowitz. So this is where the whole Dulce Base story starts, from Paul Benowitz and my dad. They get together, and like I mentioned, it's 1979. Paul comes up to my dad after the conference, and my dad had mentioned they've been seeing these strange lights flying around Dulce. And Paul tells him, well, you know what's weird? I've been seeing the same thing out of the back of my house. He lived adjacent to Kirtland Air Force Base, and he said he had been seeing similar lights flying in and out of Kirtland Air Force Base. So this piqued my dad's interest because it has a military tie. He's trying to solve these cattle mutilations. He's seen the same aircraft that they're seeing up in Dulce. So he invites Paul up to Dulce. So Paul goes up there in '79, and sure enough, like I mentioned earlier, you could see these aircraft on any given night. So Paul sees plenty of strange lights and comes back to Albuquerque. What Paul then does is contact the Air Force, and he tells Kirtland, the officials at Kirtland, hey, you guys have a problem. You have these lights that are going in and out of the base literally every night. He used to sit outside his house at night and film them. And this would be in the cold, the dark, and he'd just run cameras, and he was watching them over Coyote Canyon and the Manzano weapons area. So he had a perfect view. And what he did is he filmed them for almost a year and a half, 2 years, is the best guess we can figure out, before he even let the Air Force know what was going on. So the Air Force tells him, thank you, we're not too interested, but don't bother us. But what they really did is they started monitoring him. They did a full background investigation on him. And this is where that whole Dulce Base story starts. So it starts with Paul Benowitz. He's the key to the whole Dulce story. So as like I mentioned, and you can see up here in 1980, the Air Force gets involved with Paul. Paul had evidence from Dulce because he'd already been up there with my dad. He took pictures of some strange aircraft, and now he had pictures of Kirtland showing the same aircraft. So the Air Force had a problem. And there's other books that are written on this, Project Beta by Greg Bishop. He goes into detail and kind of talks about all the things that happened to Paul. But now the Air Force is going into defense mode because Paul has all this photographic evidence about Kirtland. It's really Kirtland. And a lot of people don't realize this, but this is the Cold War. This is back in the 80s, and you know, things were pretty tense with Russia back in the day. Here in Albuquerque, they had a lot of KGB activity trying to infiltrate Kirtland, see what was going on at Kirtland. Some of these KGB agents were acting as MUFON members, UFO members, and Paul was communicating with them. So the intelligence community, the Air Force really kept an eye on Paul because he was giving information to a lot of people. He's giving information to Peter Gerstein out of New York, Tom Adams out of Texas, Oklahoma, my dad, and then the ARPO down in Tucson. So he was giving out a lot of this evidence about highly classified military aircraft, is what we later found out. So that's where it started. So the Air Force gets Paul. They actually fly him up to Dulce. They, like I said, they did a background on him. They're monitoring him. They rented a house across the street, and they even broke into his house. They would break into his house, move his furniture around. They did a variety of things that Project Beta goes into. My book kind of touches base on it, but the whole Dulce Base story starts from this crash. Paul comes up to Dulce and he goes, hey, there's something crashed up in the Mount Archuleta, not Archuleta Mesa. It's always been a kind of a confusing point because Archuleta Mesa is in a different location. But he brings, this is one of the photos, this black and white photos, and he says, hey, a UFO crashed up at this alien base. The Air Force actually took him up there and showed him where this crash site was. My dad kind of took it with a grain of salt. Some of the tribal members that were with the tribal police kind of, well, we'll look into it. They did look into it. They went up there, and some of the stuff Paul was telling them was true, and that's what was kind of amazing. About 80% of the stuff that Paul was telling them would end up being true, and later they found out that the 20% that was false was usually the alien stuff. But this is where the whole story started, and it's from this crashed aircraft. So Paul comes up, says that an aircraft crashed up in Mount Archuleta. He had pictures, and lo and behold, and it's rugged country. It was hard to get up there, and Boyd's here. He can tell you how bad it was. We were talking about it before the conference. And there's a crash site up there. Lo and behold, right where Paul said it was. And Paul's not from Dulce, and he doesn't know where this is, and most of you probably have no idea where this is, and Paul was the same way. And we didn't find out till later that the Air Force was actually showing him the area. They showed him the crash site, and then they were telling him what was going on, and then they would add the alien stuff to kind of give him a bad reputation, because he was also contacting senators. He was contacting Pete Domenici, the newspapers, Ronald Reagan. He was even contacting Reagan, and he was pretty active. So he was a real thorn in the side for the Air Force. This is the aircraft that he said crashed up in Dulce. He witnessed it. They flew him up there, I think, on 3 occasions, and they means the Air Force. So his rendition. Recently declassified stuff shows that this is probably what they crashed up here, and it's a laser-powered aircraft. It was highly classified at the time. It's been declassified, and it's probably not even in operation, but at the time, this technology fits in perfectly with the stuff that Paul says. It may or may not be the same thing, but it's human-based, and there's a high likelihood that's what it is. And when the crash site was located, scientist out of Los Alamos kind of popped up at the right place at the right time, and he was pushing this story that it was a stealth aircraft. So for years, that crash site, we just kind of assumed it was a stealth aircraft because no one knew any better. But now the crash sites have been declassified, and we figured out that it wasn't a stealth that crashed up there. So that the question is, what did crash up there? And it was more than likely one of these secret projects out of Kirtland or Los Alamos. That part we haven't determined yet. We're still looking into it. It's another one of the photos. Paul would say that there's alien troops on the ground. You could never see it. It's about, I know it's blurry for you guys, but even the real photos about that blurry also. And like I mentioned, half the stuff he would say, or 80% was true, 20% was false. So it was kind of hard getting a good feel for him. But he had a lot of good, credible information. So when it comes down to the Dulce Base story, the Air Force actually started the story. They gave it to him as a distraction. And then they kind of added the alien stuff to get him, to discredit him. So these are more of the photos, and this is where the story started. There's a map that Paul went up there so many times on his own. Like, he wouldn't even tell my dad or the tribal police. He would just kind of show up. He was a pilot, so he could fly up there, and he would do aerial missions. He wouldn't do anything on foot. And the terrain's pretty rugged up there. But this is one of Paul's photos. He figured out how to photograph these aircraft flying in and out of this alleged base. Now, this is one of his maps, and this map's on my website. You can view it in detail. So you'll notice like the rock face in the background. It's also up here if you look at it in detail. But when we would go up to the location, we could find this rock face, and he'd tell us on the map, well, this is where a pylon is, this is where the entrance is. And he was accurate. You would find evidence of some stuff. We never found any aliens up there, but you would find a lot of interesting stuff. And so my dad was always scratching his head, like, where's this guy getting all this information from? Well, we got it from the Air Force directly, which led to another story because Richard Doty was one of the guys that was involved with Paul Benowitz, and him and Ernest Edwards. They ended up getting transferred to Germany as a disciplinary action, and that's a whole other story. But it looks like they messed up and they actually classified project by mistake. But that's government for you. So during this time period, John Lear pops up. I don't know if you've heard of him. His dad owned Lear Aircraft, and his dad was with ties to the CIA, Area 51. His brother also has ties, and Lear's a pilot. So he pops up. He's been in the UFO community for a while. He was kind of running around with Linda Howe back in the days, in this time period, the 70s and 80s. So he gets involved, and when Lear got involved, a lot of the weird stories started popping up around Dulce. Now, Lear's part of what's called the CIA Roadrunner Group. It's all these retired guys from Area 51. They get together every year and talk about stuff they did at Area 51. So it's not like you or me can just go sign up and become a member. You have to be in the crowd. So that kind of tells you something right there, why these stories were probably started. But a lot of the stories that John Lear started are where the kind of the bad stuff comes out of Dulce. One of these is the Thomas Costello story. Thomas Costello was supposedly this guard that worked at the base. He stole these photos, 5 sets of photos. You can read this is where it all started in 1987. He said that these 25 black and white photos and 6 minutes of videotape from the base were stolen, and Thomas Costello disappeared, and his family disappeared. There's different versions of the story, and sometimes Costello's added to this alleged alien firefight story. Sometimes he's not. So the internet kind of has different variations of it. The bottom line is the Thomas Costello story is false. So you're probably asking me, well, how did this start? There's another guy named Tal Levesque that kind of was involved with this out of Nevada Aerial Research. He doesn't do too much anymore, but he was pretty active back in the day. He said that he did subcontracting for the Dulce Base, and he lived in Santa Fe, and Thomas Costello was his neighbor. Well, my dad verified, and I also did it too. We contacted Tao and said, well, where did you live in Santa Fe? We'll go find your address. We can go to the assessor's office, find records. That wasn't verifiable. He couldn't provide that. If Thomas Costello was his neighbor, then that would be something we could trace. So there's a lot of stuff that we could trace. If you have family members, we could find out what school. We did all that, we looked into all that, and it always into a dead end. So the more likely that even the whole Costello story is just false. They just fabricated that out of thin air, because there's never any evidence that ever indicated he even existed. And around this time, the Dulce papers, the circulation of the Dulce papers started. A lot of people have seen that. It shows body parts in vats, severing layers to this alleged base. There's never been any proof or indication that that is true or accurate information. It did come from Lear. He actually has admitted that he drew the pictures himself based on some of this other stuff that came from Tao Levesque, but it's never been verified, and it's not credible. So you can take that story with a grain of salt. Like I said, my dad looked at it, I've looked at it, other people have looked at it, and it's never been shown to be any type of truth to it, but it's one of the weird stories that's popped up. And like I mentioned, Lear is tied into the Nevada test site. Another author, Chris Lambright, has tied Lear to Richard Doty, who I mentioned earlier, who was part of the Air Force intelligence that was messing with Paul Benowitz. But the bottom line is that story's always been false as far as the legend goes. And this brings us to another guy who's Phil Schneider. A lot of people don't realize he's also tied to Lear. He's probably more famous than Costello, but Schneider said he was an engineer that was working. He built underground bases for the military. He was starting to release information in 1996. He said, he mentioned that a supposed alien firefight that happened in 1979. His ex-wife started contacting my dad after Phil died. To top it off, he told everyone, if I die, that the government killed me because of the aliens and Dulce and all this other stuff. Well, guess what? They found him dead. So that complicates it. And to make it even worse, the police investigation wasn't very good. They found some ligature around his neck, and they didn't notice it until he got to the funeral home, so the police did a very sloppy job on it. But ultimately, they ruled it a suicide. His brother was a sheriff's deputy, so a lot of people have claimed that they covered it up. The government went in and did all this stuff, but to cover up family members and to cover up the district attorney, the mortuary, the OMI, the medical examiner, that's a lot of people to cover up. And trust me, we have nitpicked this story to death, and there's never been any evidence. Right here is Phil's Social Security statement. At the time of his death, he was receiving Social Security benefits. He had a lot of different injuries. He had the autopsy report showed his fingers were missing. He had scars all over the place. And if you look at his work history, it has nothing to do with Dulce. He worked at a shoe store during all his time frame. And that's an important piece of evidence, because how was he receiving benefits? The government's not just going to give you money if you go in and say, well, I worked over here. They're going to verify where your employment was. And his employment has nothing to do with engineering. So there was never any credibility to that. Like I said, you can believe what you want, or hopefully you can go find something that proves it was true that he worked there, but good luck, because we've really looked into it and we've never found anything to verify his claims. He had we looked into his medical records. He said he was injured in this firefight. You can't find any of that stuff, which would have been pretty easy for him to provide. And his ex-wife was asking for money also when after he died. She was trying to raise money. That may or may not be the reason why this started. We don't know, but she's the one that actually started a lot of the stories. He was doing presentations right before he died, and she kind of continued with his information afterwards. But as far as the Phil Schneider story is concerned, it's been proven as false, because at first you have this work history, but this is the key to why it was proven false. It's based off the alien firefight. And you can see here, this is Paul Benowitz's letter to Pete Domenici. The Air Force started that whole alien firefight story. As I mentioned earlier, 20% of the stuff was junk that they were giving him. And he's the one that started this. You can look at the date, 1981. So Phil Schneider doesn't come in the picture till 96, so this story's been floating around for quite a while. And you can see here that he's the one that started to talk about the alien firefight, that alien several years ago on the Indian land, talking about Dulce, and there's this transfer of technology and all this fun stuff. So people don't realize that Paul Benowitz is actually the one that started the alien firefight story, but it's a false story that was given to him by the Air Force actually started it. It was part of the game they were playing with him. And this story is very confusing. It was made confusing on purpose because they were putting the full court press on him. They were worried about the KGB, and I mean the Air Force when I say they. The CIA is involved in this. You have NSA also involved, and that's where this story comes from. So anyone that has their stories based on this 79 firefight, it's false. There's also a guy who claims his name is Colonel X. It says that he was up in Dulce. He said that 77 people died in this underground firefight, and the tribal police and the New Mexico State Police removed the bodies. Well, you have Raleigh's boys are here, Hoyt's here, I'm here. I can tell you my dad never removed 77 people from any underground alien base. The tribal, like the Raleigh's kids and Hoyt will tell you the same thing. They weren't involved in any of that junk, but that's a story that floats around. They looked into the possibility of it even happening. They looked at death records. If 77 people die, assuming they have parents that are alive, that's double that, that's 140 roughly. If they're married, you add another 70 people, 77. If they have kids, that stuff is very easy to trace, but you can't find anything. If 77 people died in one day, there's a lot of people in here. If half the people in here died, there would be a record of it. And we looked into it, trust us. It's very boring and monotonous, but there's no record of it. And my dad used all his law enforcement tricks, contacts. I've done it also, and there's just no record of it. So that story dies out pretty quick. So that's a good way to tell if someone's kind of blowing your smoke up your leg about Dulce, is if they base it on that, on the firefight story. But and it's common, you'll see it in a lot of stuff. So what is the truth? Because like I said, there's a lot of partial truths in this story. The story's made confusing on purpose. That's what it was designed to do. So there's parts that are true, and parts of the story that were true is you have the Redding Ranch. Paul said that there was a base on the north side of because the picture I showed you earlier, the black and white, it's literally on the New Mexico-Colorado state line. So this would be on the Colorado side, on the north side of Mount Archuleta. There's guard towers up there. He said it was built in 1948 under this Smith Lumber Corporation. That could just be a false story that they told him. But you see there's guard towers, that's at the Redding Ranch. There's a cabin. NIDS is a group, that's another story, but I'm not gonna get into that. Came up and kind of looked at what these guard towers were, and they said they're just hunting towers. You can decide for yourself if they're just hunting towers, but if you're gonna go hunting, you're probably not gonna sleep there and then climb up there. You're gonna go out in the middle, because we're from northern New Mexico, we hunt all the time. That's a duty location is what it looks like. So, but you can decide if it's a hunting tower, because that's the excuse. Norio showed this picture. This ranch has several of these towers, and this is coming in from the north side of Colorado. There was also an airstrip up there. There's the guard towers, there's a hangar. The ownership changed several times. Edmund Gomez looked into it. It floated around, went from corporation to corporation. That was a common CIA trick. They still do that actually now, and then it went back to William Redding, who was the last owner. And now the Southern Ute tribe owns it. So it has a weird title history and deed history to it. And it's kind of been pawned around, so that's where I mentioned earlier NIDS comes into the picture. They were the ones that looked into the tower story, and they said, well, they're just hunting towers. I don't think they're hunting towers, because Paul said that's where the base was. To kind of give you a quick summary, like I said, I'm gonna blow through this pretty quick. It was an off-site testing facility for Kirtland, just like, I call it Area 52, because I don't have a better word for it, but Area 51 isn't really that big of a secret, because everyone knows where it's at. But Dulce, back in the 80s, was a perfect place to test all this stuff, this advanced aircraft. So you're wondering, how do you know that? On some of these expeditions, we'd take pictures and we'd go and develop the film, and we'd find these aircraft would come out. They're not alien aircraft, they're highly advanced military aircraft. They were invisible to the naked eye and they were silent. Michael touched based on some of the propulsion systems and the camouflage systems. That was very active and available in the 80s, so I can imagine what they have now. For some reason, the camera lens will pick it up, but the human eye would trick it. It's designed to do that. So once we figured out that it would do that, we would just take random pictures of the area, and a lot of times we get pictures of these highly classified military aircraft in the pictures, and it was all around the Dulce, the Mount Archuleta area. So it looked like it was an off-site testing facility for Kirtland Air Force Base. And this shows you how the mutilations kind of progress because they're tied together. The mutilations are based out of the same programs, and I can go into detail on it later. That's another kind of a side story, but you can see here how this animal was cooked, and they were using high-powered microwave. A lot of microwave technology is involved in this, and that's a lot of the stuff that's still classified. They're kind of touchy on that. They don't like people talking about it too much, but bottom line, the mutilations, it comes down to they were creating vaccines for germ warfare. Like I said, you have three options: aliens, predators, humans. All the evidence, and there's plenty of it if you sit down and look at it, points to government testing, clandestine testing of vaccines for germ warfare. You kind of have this Ebola stuff out in the news. That's the kind of stuff they're testing because the Russians, remember, we're going back to the 70s and 80s, the Russians had similar programs. They were doing it secretly because there's a treaty where they're not supposed to be doing it, both countries, Russia and the US. That doesn't mean they stopped, they just pushed it underground. And that's what all these cattle, what they were killing them for. So if you have a military person, they'll probably tell you, we're doing it for you, but they should just go buy the cattle. But that leaves a trail. And like I mentioned earlier, there's treaties, they're not supposed to be messing with this stuff to begin with, but they do it anyway. So. And that's the gist of what all the mutilations. So this NIDS comes up, and they start investigating a lot of this stuff, and they're a whole nother story also. Like I said, there's a lot of branches to this tree, so they're good to look into. I'm not going to go into detail with them now, but that's another story. It's tied to some of the infamous Skinwalker Ranch. Some of you people probably know about it, but you can look into that also. But they were involved in the Dulce story. They're just kind of low-key. They were pretty quiet about it, the stuff they did up there. So this is one of the photos that Paul took outside of Kirtland Air Force Base, and you can see it has this air spike. They didn't really quite know what it was at the time, but it's not alien. Of course, pre-9/11, the argument is anything could fly over Kirtland Air Force Base. There wasn't security. What's going to happen? But after 9/11, if any of you are crazy enough, you try to fly over Kirtland Air Force Base, you probably get shot down. That's controlled airspace, so they're not going to let anything. This is a 1979 photo of what Paul was picking up, but you'll see here in a second, they still have that same aircraft because in 2013, people here in Albuquerque, witnesses, are seeing the same aircraft flying in and out of the base. So if they're flying in and out of the base, it's our stuff. It's not going to be belong to someone else, or they'd be attacking it or shooting it down because and it's gets back into some of the technology that Michael talked about earlier with you have the laser propulsion, the magnetic propulsion, you get into a lot of weird stuff. Of course, you have Sandia right here, so it shouldn't be a surprise. If it's going to be developed, it's going to be here in Albuquerque. There's some pretty smart people working around here. So you have to decide on the Dulce story if it's aliens or military. Paul always claimed that it was a NASA project. The space stuff, a lot of this stuff is based off space technology, and some of the programs are running out of space. I mentioned earlier some of the laser stuff. That's tied in here, and that's a very good indication of more than likely what Paul stumbled upon. Recently, declassified documents show a lot of that stuff. It's very boring. You have to know what you're looking for, but if you look for it, there's a ton of information that you can find on these projects. You just gotta know where to look for it, and you gotta have the time to do it too, which is kind of a pain. But a lot of this is just human-based. You can go back and it's all military projects. There's still a possibility it's aliens. Knock yourself out if you can find it. We've looked into that. It's just that trail gets cold right away, where this other trail stays hot. You can keep digging and digging and digging, and you pretty much keep going until you come into something that's active where it's still currently classified. I mentioned earlier there's one of Paul's old photos from the 79, and there's a 2013. That's over Kirtland Air Force Base. So it's obviously the Air Force, one of their projects, because they're not going to just let anything fly over the base without uncontested. So this is one of the laser programs that they were developing as part of NASA. And like I mentioned, Paul had always said it was a NASA project. He would kind of mix up some of the stuff, but that was one of the things that looks like he was telling the truth. This has been declassified, this Lightcraft project. It may or may not be the one, but see this bell shape? This bell shape was pretty common with all the film that he was taking, and it's tied into all this laser technology, and it's pretty cutting edge. It supposedly doesn't exist, but you know how the military technology is usually 20, 30 years off. What they tell you doesn't exist, they probably have it already. And based on Paul's stuff and what's going on now, there's a good chance that this is fully developed, but you'll have to decide for yourself, or wait and see until they declassify it. And like this old laser stuff, you can see how they have different renditions of this Delta ship. That's even what he called it. The crash site up at Mount Archuleta was a Delta ship. And this is called the Delta ship. It's based off this ground-based laser, but you see it from, they have different angles. If you view it, it looks like this bell-shaped UFO that he would see that literally every night. He could set his watch because he knew what time they would come up at a certain time. He'd set up his cameras. And he'd just sit there for hours on end. A lot of times it'd be 20 degrees outside in January, and he'd sit there in a sleeping bag and just film and film and film. And people would see it, the state police office here in Albuquerque would get reportings of these strange lights, and they'd just send it to the Air Force, and the reports just died off. So he did stumble on, from all the evidence shows that he stumbled on a pretty high-tech military project. And there's more of some of the, so these are the aircraft he was filming over at Kirtland, and I tell people, don't automatically assume they're alien. Any type of investigation, it doesn't matter if it's a murder, rape, they're really not that hard to do. All you have to do is rule out everything else and what you're left standing with. So you have to rule out, if someone stole something in here, I have to rule out every person in the room until you have the one person left that's the most likely subject, or the two or three, and then from there you can kind of narrow it down. In the past, they've always assumed that these weird lights are over Kirtland were alien, but you can see now we do have the technology that shows it's not necessarily alien, so don't make that assumption. If the evidence takes you there and it shows that it's not human, fine, but at least look in that direction, and then you can make that determination later. But the stuff that we've always looked at from Kirtland and from Paul and the Dulce story has always had a human tie to it, and you can backtrack it, and I can show it to you if you want to see it, so just contact me and I'll show you what we have. This is one of the photos that Paul took up at Mount Archuleta. He was talking about these pylons, he circled it. I think, well, I know some people have been up there, they've actually seen, there were some photos floating around from some of the locals in Dulce that had photos of this, but they're kind of hard to track down. And you look at this laser project, this ground-based laser launch facility, these aircraft were using these pylons, and it's based off an underground configuration. Is this the Dulce Base? I can't tell you for sure, but it's a high likelihood. This project is from the 70s, it's so old now, it's what's been declassified. So this is more than likely what was going on there. We're doing a project, and you hear a lot of stories about Dulce being tied to Area 51, to Los Alamos through an underground rail. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that. It's possible, but that doesn't mean it's true. But for some reason, that's a popular rumor, and it could be. They have the technology, so that could be true, but it's kind of an urban legend that you hear. What is more than likely the case is these satellite towers and laser towers are connected, and they use high top mountain ridges. And if you read the report, it goes into detail. It's a lot of nerd stuff. But it's way beyond my capability. But it'll tell you how they use mountaintops and how they use these lasers and pylons to connect stuff and communicate. It's a communication, space communication system and space aircraft system. It's actually pretty interesting. Like I said, it's nerd stuff, and I'm kind of a nerd. To see like how they even thought of some of these projects and controlling these aircraft through space using ground-based laser systems in the middle of nowhere. And that's what a lot of this evidence points to. And that's what a lot of the stuff they were showing him at Dulce and the Redding Ranch. They were using the Redding Ranch as a testing facility. You can look at all the different the dates, because a lot of people will say, well, that can't be alien. We don't have that, or it has to be alien because that's not American stuff, or we got it from Roswell. But that's not the case. If you look at a lot of this stuff, it dates back the 60s, the 70s. A lot of it goes back even farther than that if you actually research it. So that kind of, as far as Dulce, I'm not lumping the whole entire UFO alien phenomena into that. I'm just talking about Dulce. If you look at the Dulce stuff and the stuff that was seen at Dulce, the time frame is perfect because a lot of this was developed in the 60s, the 50s, even 40s. So keep that in mind if you decide to look into this in more detail. It even shows you like all the different companies involved. And there's plenty of this. You can find a lot of this information if you sit down and just take time to look for it. So what does this mean? The technology coincides with mutilations in the UFO reports. The UFO sightings around Dulce have a human and military explanation. It's tied out of Kirtland, Sandia. Pretty much couldn't have a better place to build it. Of course, New Mexico's famous for all the UFO stuff. But they're all tied to Kirtland and to the military. So, like I mentioned earlier, Paul Benowitz was correct as in initial discoveries minus the alien stories. So if you read through, he did a manuscript called Project Beta, and it was how to deal with aliens when they attack you. If you can read, and if you guys don't know the story about Paul, they eventually drove him crazy. They sent him to a mental institution, and he died, I think, in 2003. And it's actually a sad story because they drove the guy crazy. He was a sharp guy. But if you go back and read his old stuff, if you just remove alien, you get a very accurate picture of what our technology is currently, what we currently have or what we had at the time. You know, he's not as crazy as a lot of people pegged him. I met him, we used to go to his house all the time. He was just very, very passionate about all this stuff, which most people are. You'll see that in the UFO groups. A lot of them get pretty passionate, and he was no exception. But they used that against him, and like I said, they break into his house when he was gone, move the furniture around, and it eventually wore him down, which is sad, because he was a sharp guy. So this comes into the alien-human stories. This is a cow that they found up in Dulce. They did testing on it. Some people think it's a alien hybrid, cross-genetic. The vet said it was just a deformed calf. But you can see how it adds different parts to the story. Some people interpret it certain ways. So you have to decide. It's up to you. Do you decide it's alien or do you decide it's government? Like I told you earlier, I rule out humans. My job, my dad, we look at it from a law enforcement because that's our background. Our whole outlook on this was to rule out humans before you can jump to aliens. And if you do that, you can't even get that far. But it's up to you. You can look into it however you want and view it however you want, because if you at least know where the stories came from in regards to Dulce, and that's what the book does. It tells you the history of how everything came about, what's wrong, what's right. You can at least make your own decision. So that's what it comes down to. You're going to have to decide if it's alien or human. I've never seen anything alien in Dulce. You probably have people in Dulce who will tell you otherwise. So it comes down to your own choice. And like I mentioned earlier, Michael had some pictures in his presentation. We've had a lot of this technology that's not a human working on that aircraft. You know, we have Project Silverbug from the 1955. So when you have a lot of these UFO sightings, you get these people who say, well, I've never seen anything like that. That's not technology we have. That's a dangerous statement because it's not coming from an aeronautical engineer. I don't know enough about engineering, so if I see something weird, I just call it unidentified until I can try to figure out what it is. A lot of people jump the gun and they assume it's an alien because it's strange. I've seen aircraft or these weird lights do things that I never thought aircraft could do, but I don't have the experience in aviation to tell you if it's good or not. So in the meantime, I've always held on, my dad kind of held on to, let's wait and see, and let's rule out humans. And that's the problem here is we do have a lot of this technology. That starts a whole other argument, because then they'll say, well, where do we get the technology from, the Roswell or whatever? That's for you guys to decide, but that's how we look at it, and that's what I recommend. If you're gonna dig into it, look at it from that direction. So you come down, like I mentioned, you have two theories. You can go on the alien theory or just it's government technology. Alien theory kind of has some gaps in it. You have Roswell, Blue Book, then it's dead for a while. Then you have this is in regards to Dulce. I'm not talking about other stuff. I'm limiting it to Dulce because people get mad at me sometimes and say, you're trying to explain the whole UFO from now on. I'm not. I'm just trying to tell you what happened in Dulce. So you kind of have this timeline. You have the cat mutilation start in the 60s. One of the popular theories about the mutilations that cattle are a food source, or they're this genetic testing that they're doing. You have the abductions. Then there's no reports of mutilations for a time. There's gaps in the story. The problem with a lot of this stuff is the people that push this story are usually government employees. A lot of the stories come from the Air Force or former Air Force employees. They have a vested interest in the government and the projects. So Lear's a good example of that. So when you look into it, take that with a grain of salt and look at everything before you come to a conclusion. And like I said earlier, this is focused on Dulce. So when you come to the Dulce story, when you look at it as far as human military technology and theory, this timing fits perfect. Because you have, Norio mentioned some of the paperclip scientists that were out here. So you get this German technology, they develop it here in New Mexico. You know what happens here in New Mexico, you have the bomb, you have all the different bases, you have Cannon, Kirtland, Los Alamos, Holloman. So we have a lot of high-tech stuff here, and the space to test it. So it makes sense that this is a perfect place to do all this stuff. Roswell crash, everyone kind of assumes it's aliens, but they also have to rule out, is there human involvement? That hasn't been determined yet. That's still up in the air. You can look into that. I'm not an expert on Roswell, so I'm not going to get into that. A lot of people assume Blue Book was created to track new technology, to track UFO technology or alien, but you have to rule out maybe it was created to track our technology and see who was seeing these sightings to keep it classified. That's a possibility. There's no proof either way yet, but keep that in the back of your mind. You have projects like Silverbug that show we do have some of that saucer-type aircraft. Lonnie Zamora, a few people have mentioned it earlier. The mutilations show that there was advanced aircraft technology. And I didn't even scratch the surface on the mutilations and some of the Dulce stuff. But there's a lot of aircraft involvement in the mutilations. And like I said, I didn't mention it because we don't have time. And a lot of the stuff that my dad acquired in the 80s shows that the U.S. aircraft was silent and invisible. There's a picture in the book that shows the aircraft we're talking about. Like I said, so all the evidence points that the Dulce Base was an off-site testing facility for advanced military aircraft. Some people argue with me, that's fine. But I grew up there and was involved. We used to get all the different researchers from all over the country would show up at the house. My mom would make them dinner. So at any given time, they've all been at the house. I've heard all the different things. We've looked at a lot of different things, and that's where everything points to. Like Norio mentioned, I'm going to give you guys, if you guys want a free copy of the PDF, it's a history of the Dulce Base. I have some cards in the back, get a hold of me, it has an email address. They're going to post it on the website. Feel free to download it, but at least you'll know what happened. And then you can decide from there if there's aliens or military, whatever the case. So, and then this is kind of where we're wrapping it up, because I don't want to spend too much time with them. If you guys have any questions, I'm going to be in the back, and thank you guys for listening to me. I hope I wasn't too boring.
If you liked this video, be sure to check out our other content and get connected on our page and social media sites. Every day, new discoveries are being made all across the world and beyond. So let's work together to find out what's next. And remember, we won't know if we don't go. I'll see you in the vortex.